Welcome to Uncorked, a cult wines podcast where we take you behind the scenes of the fine wine market. I'm joined by my co-host, Jonathan Stevenson, who I think from now on is going to be going through the moniker of Jay, as we more commonly know you.
Yep, that's me.
And Jonathan is our EVP of North America. And I'm your host, other co-host, Tom Gearing, CEO and co-founder of Cult Wines. And this week, we're very pleased to be joined by our colleague and Chief Revenue Officer, Aarash Ghatineh.
Hello.
Welcome, Aarash.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're absolutely delighted to have you on board. And I think for this particular episode, you'll be much needed. So today, we're going to be looking at the fallout from Bordeaux Entrepreneur 2024. For our first episode, if you listened in, we were kind of at the beginning of the campaign. The campaign is now over in terms of all the wines have been released, and we'll be evaluating the winners, the losers, and actually kind of digging in through the weeds of some of the feedback and some of the commentary that's been in the wine market. So we've introduced a new feature for this week's podcast, which is a look at the papers, where we'll be looking at Jancis Robinson and Neil Martin's articles that recently came out talking about the state of the Bordeaux market. We've also brought some fun into this week and a bit of a challenge with Aarash being here. He likes to say within Cult Wines that he's the best blind taster, so we're putting him up to the test.
That's not true. That's not true. I think I said that once. Ever.
So we're going to be blind tasting a wine. So I'll be introduced a little bit later on. We'll also be looking across the pond to the US with news around a very significant wine collection coming to auction. That's of very well-known wine collector William Koch. So we'll be talking about that. And also some interesting sales data out of the US, which, although volumes are down, are talking about wine sales in 2024 in value terms being up, which is somewhat contrary to the kind of doom and gloom and negative media spiral we've seen around wine in recent months and recent weeks. So that's this week's episode, and we look forward to you joining us. So now we got that out of the way, we can get into the main thrust of it.
Yeah.
So look, obviously, new guest is sitting here on the sofa.
Esteemed new guest.
Exactly, esteemed new guest. So we're going to kick off with a couple of questions just to kind of wet your whistle and get things flowing. So, Jonathan, have you got a couple of questions for Aarash?
Yeah, indeed. Or Jay. Or Gat. We can call you Gat, I think, maybe.
No, Aarash is fine.
Aarash is good.
Fine,
okay,
yeah.
So, I think first up, we wanted to know what's been on your radar, and perhaps more specifically, a trade that you saw or made that you felt like was a bit of a steal in recent times.
Good question. There are a few. Obviously, we're in a market where there's quite a lot of opportunity. So I could probably rattle off 10. How many do you need?
Yeah, just go with one.
Just go
one
with
will
one.
do. One will do.
Okay.
One to start.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think recently I've seen a really interesting trade on a wine from Chile called Senya. The 2018, which is regarded as one of their best vintages, is currently trading at around £50 per bottle.
Right.
Okay. And if you think about that as being one of the iconic wines of Chile, if not the New World territories, with really high score from critics, I think pound for pound that's a great value buy. And something that I've got in my cellar, and I encourage people to have in their cellars, because at that price having one of the best wines from Chile.
Well, that's what I was about to say. It's weird because when you think of Senya, you kind of think of it as an icon, right, of South America, and then to think of the price point you talked about there at £50, it kind of feels contradictory to, okay, you think of an iconic wine from the US or an iconic wine from France or an iconic Italian wine, you're thinking probably four figures in terms of the price point. So to kind of get in at an iconic level of status and quality, but be paying, well, I mean, £50 per bottle sounds incredible to me in terms of a opportunity.
I mean, it's an absolute steal of a trade. But also just looking at it within the context of Senya vintages, there's vintages that are 2015, 2016 that are trading at 30-40% above the 18. So, and
of course Chilean wines have been put on the map this year. Well, this year, but technically sort of 2024, the end of 2024.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
With obviously Vina Don Melchor winning Wine Spectator's Wine of the Year.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, that's a good one to talk about, just to see the price appreciation of a wine winning that award, such as Don Melchor. And also, I think, to your point around sort of Chilean wines being a little bit more of a consideration as a collectible wine, I think that really proved that you can acquire these wines at pretty attractive pricing and actually see quite pretty decent return off the back of that.
And also I think it's interesting because it's a wine that's distributed through the Place de Bordeaux, which obviously we'll come on to talk a little bit about in the later part of the pod. And then in terms of what's been on my radar to answer that question, 2019 Burgundy.
Yeah.
2019 Burgundy.
From a qualitative or quantitative perspective?
Both, mate. Yeah. Honestly, like I think that's now for me being recognised as one of the greatest modern vintages of Burgundy. Not just for the reds, which we knew about when we tasted it, out of barrel, but also from the whites that I've tasted as well. And we can't always take responsibility for like unearthing these. I mean, obviously, you have to get market intel. We had some really interesting market intel from one of the top producers in Burgundy.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to tell that story, right? So,
I don't necessarily.
So just to put it in a bit of context, I'm on a WhatsApp wine group with quite a lot of collectors in there. Just happens to be a few winemakers, producers, winery owners on there. And Erwin Faverley from Domaine Faverley is in that group, and he was asked a question around his favourite vintages of red and white since the turn of the century, since 2000. Obviously, what comes to mind for me is straight away sort of 2010 is going to be up there. Of course, 16, these big vintages, that have really, stole the show. Of course, 2020, right vintages like 18. But for red, he kind of ranked his top 5 vintages. And for him, he said head and shoulders, the number one was 2019. And I think that was interesting because when I communicated with you, we were kind of in a position where we hadn't tasted a lot of 19s probably since they came out. So then we were like made an effort, I think, in the last 2 or 3, 4 months to drink more 2019s. Obviously, I've been fortunate to taste the Domaine de la Romilly Conti recently from 19. You tasted some Olivier Bernstein recently, as well as even at my wedding, which was recently, where you guys both came. I opened a large format of a Premier Cru from Domaine Top of the Mom 2019. But every single one. I mean, how would you describe it from a qualitative perspective? I mean, Jay, you were there.
Fresh. Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's always just interesting as well from that point to get that when you get a really honest appraisal from a producer in that environment, which is maybe not away from the sort of limelight of like a tasting or, maybe sometimes when we've all been to Bordeaux, when it's in that room of, you're kind of maybe second guessing a bit of the rhetoric around, well, we understand that you perhaps have quite a lot of volume of that particular vintage. It might be pushed as a bit of a rhetoric that you're trying to kind of make out as something. But when you get it in that off camera type approach from a producer and it's like, that's the vintage, then obviously it sounds like it's, I've not had much of it myself,
if I can step in, I've, to your point, I've been fortunate enough to taste quite a lot of bottles over the last, let's say 6 months. And I would say the characteristics of the vintage it's quite weird because you get wines that are like quite high alcohol because it was hot, right? So you got like 14, 15%, Pinots. But you don't feel it. Okay. And then you got wines that are like 12.5% as well. So it's quite a wide spread in terms of like the alcohol levels. Characteristically for the reds, extremely precise. Very there's a lot of energy in the wines, but not an overpowering energy. It's like really bright, energetic red fruit, but in a very balanced and precise way. And for the whites, it's just, they're very rich, but they've still got that like nice structure and acidity. So some standouts. I'd say
what's been your pick of red and white?
Durocher, Gevrey, Chambertin, just the Village 2019 was very good. You mentioned it, Bernstein Champeau 19. Wow, incredible. And I had Domaine Totochot Grand Cru Chambertin.
Nice,
which is very good as well. So, and then for the whites, just some, Village from Sauzet, some whites from Drouin, which are always very good.
I think for the 19 reds, the 2 words that come to my mind straight away for the vintage is approachability and ageability. And I think that's such a rarity sometimes.
Have the two together.
With, fine wine in particular. Sometimes you get these great vintages, but they really are built for the long term. You have to be patient. You have to, time rewards patience. But I think with the 19s, it's got the stuffing, it's got the contents, it's got the ability with the acidity and with the volume of fruit to age effortlessly. But you can pop corks now and drink them, and you're just like, wow, this is enjoyable. This doesn't feel like infanticide to open them now. This feels like you're getting something out of it at an early stage. So 19 Burgundy looks like a vintage that could, and also price wise, 19 Burgundy looks, prices obviously have come down, but there's some attractive opportunities, right, from a price perspective.
Absolutely.
I was going to say just quickly as well, I think regarding the last decade, which has clearly been a massive like jump forward in terms of like, I think the consistent quality of vintages across, well, let's look at Burgundy and Bordeaux. I think it's almost like a hindsight decade where actually, like you're saying, maybe on the first notion of the 19s, you're kind of picking apart these vintages, much like we have done for Bordeaux over the last decade, where it's like, that's a good vintage, that's another good vintage. You know, where does it really fall into place? And actually, stylistically, what is actually going to really find that balance between aging and approachability, which clearly is now starting to become more of a factor, particularly for Bordeaux, which we'll come on to. But I feel like that hindsight now for this last decade is starting to show through, with the 19s starting to be like, oh, hang on a minute, this is actually exactly what you're looking for.
It's quite a controversial one though, because you do have quite an old school style of Burgundy drinker that is saying this is not proper Burgundy. You know? But then you know, I think back to like the 80s and 90s, and you go, okay, 70s, you got 71 and 78 come to mind as two great vintages. But apart from that, the rest of the 70s was, you know, it was a horror show, really. There's not great quality there. In the 80s, of course, you had slightly better vintages, 89, 85 immediately come to mind, maybe 81 as well. Then in the 90s, okay, 90 was good, you know, 95, 96, and then 99. But, you know, then you look, okay, maybe we're fortunate, but you look at like 2010 onwards, and you'd say like there's so many great vintages. I think what the difficulty is for, you know, Burgundy wine growers now is obviously the picking and the harvesting now coming into sort of like late August because of the climatic changes. It's getting earlier and earlier each year. And I think the challenge is when you do drink vintages, maybe like 18 that are super hot, ripe vintages, is can they get that balance between kind of picking at the right level of ripeness, but also maintaining that freshness. And I think sometimes in those vintages where it's tough, people either pick too early and you get too much greenness in there and you don't get enough of the fruit, or they pick too late and it almost becomes a bit too jammy and you don't get enough of the freshness and the acidity. So the 19 for me is kind of like the best of both worlds, in which I think can appease and appeal to the classic Burgundy collectors, but also I think is attractive whoever you give it to. I don't think you can give a 19 to anyone and they'll say that's not a great bottle of Pinot Noir. Yeah. And are there any other vintages? Obviously you don't only drink Burgundy at a wedding, you drink it all the time. So are there any other vintages that you think like similar to 19 that you've had that, you know, are in a really good spot? Yeah,
I mean, the one for me that always stands out is 2012. Because, I mean, I would say it's probably classified as an off vintage. But I think the 2012, again, to your point around maybe sort of that more classic style, the acidity and the freshness is amazing. It maybe wasn't as ripe, it didn't hit the heights of, say, some of these vintages we just talked about in terms of the ripeness of the fruit, but there's a real like ethereal balance. There's this real nice aromatic expression. And I think the best 2012s have like a beautiful balance. And the way I like to think about it is kind of like that, you know, the iron fist and the velvet glove. And I think the best 2012s,
chestnut.
But I think the best 2012s find that really nice balance between the two. So that's probably one for me that's a little bit under the radar. But I think every time I have a 2012, I'm always like massively impressed.
Before we move geographically across France, I was just going to say, do you think that given, I mean, we'll perhaps come on to a bit more of the sort of difficulties or challenges faced with Bordeaux. But with Burgundy in mind, I think it's quite evident from what you've just said there. And I think even if you were to have had that conversation 5-10 years ago, I think because of Burgundy's acceleration into prominence and you know, favour, essentially, I think the breadth of accessibility is probably increased, even though it's naturally a region that is much harder to come by in terms of getting access to the very top stuff. Do you think that's actually almost helped the fact that there's far more familiar producers now in circulation? There's more access points. There's more, you know, I think more people drinking Burgundy as a result of its rise to prominence versus what we'll come on to shortly, which is obviously Bordeaux and the challenges around almost oversupply, over familiarity with the region.
I think the other advantage that Burgundy has over Bordeaux, and I think what Aarash mentioned around sort of the Rocher, Gevrey Chambertin, is that, you know, you don't have to buy the Grand Cru to access these domains and producers. Like the Rocher, Chambertin, Clos de Bears, we're talking about sort of high 3 figures, if not 4 figures for some vintages, right? You know, and that's pretty inaccessible for a lot of people. But actually, you can also buy the Bourgogne or village level for sub £100 a bottle.
Yeah, like 80 quid a bottle, I'd say,
Even some instances, and maybe less than £50 a bottle. Okay, it's still expensive for wine, but in the context of getting access to that brand and that domain, you know, you can't necessarily do that in, say, Bordeaux. And that's where maybe a bit of the friction point occurs, because you can only drink Petrus and it's Petrus and that's it. There's no other option outside of that one particular
and Petrus aside, obviously, there's more of a blend aspect as well, right? So it's like, at least with Burgundy, you're pretty much sticking to
And so to your point, like I know people, especially in sort of Asia, who've started this, becoming collectors and getting into the wine scene. And, if you look at the types of wines they were drinking and buying and collecting early on, it was kind of the Village or the Premier Cru levels of these top brands and domains, because it was a great entry point for them to kind of both learn and educate themselves, but also because it was easier to access. To your point, there's a lot more of those types of wines, and it's easier for those producers to increase the volume of a Gevrey Chambertin, Village that they're producing versus, acquiring more Grand Cru vineyards, which is going to be difficult.
Yeah.
So I think that's helped the overall kind of Burgundy, Burgundy system.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's an interesting point in time to change tack towards Bordeaux. Obviously, we talked about Bordeaux when we spoke last, and since then the vintage is obviously completed. We've seen everything released. I think I'm already starting to think about everything we've just talked about there for good reasons as to why Burgundy has had a good run. Let's sort of maybe lean on that into what's been the overall tone, Aarash, from the vintage perspective. How have you felt the vintage or the campaign has been received into market? What are your sort of headline thinkings around Bordeaux 24?
Yeah, I think Bordeaux had a tough gig. Releasing their wines in a quite fragile market was always going to be a challenge. So I think anyone entering this campaign that didn't recognise that is probably a little bit naive. The reception for the market has been probably lukewarm. And a lot of the releases, I think, haven't necessarily hit the mark in terms of screaming value. Okay. And we're in a market where there is a lot of choice. Okay. We know that. It's not just about Bordeaux. There's a lot of choice for like wines with age.
Yeah.
So if you put yourself in the consumer, collector, investor seat, you really have to be motivated to buy the wines.
Yeah.
Okay. That being said, it doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities.
Yeah.
And I think from my perspective, mainly on kind of a relative value side as opposed to the qualitative side, because I haven't tasted loads of 2024s.
Yeah.
I've actually got tasting next week in terms of barrel samples at the office to obviously understand a little bit more about the vintage. But I think there's approximately 18-20 wines that you can make a case for.
Yeah.
Okay. And there's probably 8 to 10 wines that you just buy because they're the cheapest available vintage for their quality.
Yeah.
So, Lefit, I know that was covered on the previous pod. Angelus as well. Pavillon Rouge, Pavillon McCann, Lynch Barge, all those labels. I think they came at the right price point.
I was just going to say, look, let's get into the nitty gritty of it in terms of actual numbers. Only 8 Chateaux released their 24 at a recommended retail price lower than any other available vintage.
Yeah.
Was that above or below your expectations for the vintage?
Below expectations. Yeah, below expectations.
Do you think they've missed an opportunity there? Do you think it's... I mean, how do you assess that decision making in terms of a pricing policy?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a complex... it's a complex situation with what's happening at the moment, because you have a number of back vintages that are available at attractive prices
in volume.
Okay. That's also not necessarily in volume, but there are prints, there are trades at those price points. So
let me just run you through a list of names, because I think although despite it only being 8 that were the best price, there are some nice names in here. So Pavillon McCann, of course, Premier Grand Cru Class A from Saint-Emilion, Livre, Poifferet, Deuxième Cru Class A, Lynch Barge, Du Cru Bouquetot, Pavillon Rouge de Château Margaux, Le Petit Mouton, Château Angelus, Château Mouton Rothschild, Château Lefit Rothschild. There's some big names there for sure, right?
Yeah.
So it kind of shows that the big names were willing to kind of get to a price to really inspire the market and to incentivize people, but it wasn't necessarily followed through.
Yeah. Yeah, but what makes a successful campaign? Okay, you have to look at like all of the stakeholders.
Yeah.
Okay, the chateau, they obviously need and want to sell their wines each year.
The hard graft.
Yeah, you've got the negociants who are responsible for the distribution of those wines, and then you've got businesses like ourselves and merchants around the world that have to communicate the message around the quality, the price, what's fair.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't think
there's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts, but I think that in order for it to be a successful on-premier campaign for a wine investor, you don't need 100 of the wines to be.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
You don't need 50.
Yeah.
You can make let's say 8 to 20 to work.
In
order for it to be a successful on-premier campaign for a wine merchant,
they're looking for more.
Yeah, you're looking for more. You want to have you want to be able to demonstrate value to your clients across the spectrum, not just on your first growth Bordeaux, or not just on like your equivalent of like the same quality. In
terms of like the commentary around the vintage. So to your point you just made around sort of, well, there is at least 8 wines that were the cheaper than any other vintage. There's probably at least 20 that look good value to buy. But as you said, that's out of maybe over 100 releases, right?
Yeah.
But as you said, it doesn't necessarily need to be 100 out of 100 to make a campaign. Is that probably one of the negative sides of the market, whereby it has to be, it's all or nothing, right?
Yeah.
If there's enough that didn't release at a good price, it's labeled a bad vintage. You just get this real kind of like generalized view of, oh, well, the majority, fine, it can be the majority out of 100 that maybe didn't release at the right price. It's immediately labelled as a bad vintage. I wouldn't buy this vintage. The pricing was wrong. The quality's not there.
Yeah.
But it's completely ignoring the fact that there's probably 20 wines that are of good quality that were released at attractive prices, of which at least 50% are cheaper than any other vintage you can buy of that producer. So it's never, obviously it's grey, it's not black and white, but I feel like there's always a need. I feel like in the wine market, there's always a need to generalise. There's always this trend towards generalisation. I need to be able to summarise a vintage in one word. It can either be good or bad. It can either be prime or off prime.
But of course, it's either cheap or expensive.
Cheap or expensive. But you
just
get these people labelling it going, oh, it's an expensive bad vintage, and I'm like, well, yeah, that might be the case of some wines that came out, but it's just not true.
We were talking about this earlier, right? I think it's a really interesting point. I think the fact that we started off in Burgundy is a really interesting way to look at it. Is Bordeaux, I think, is a massive victim of its own success in many ways. And I think also the big word for me is like connectivity between all these aspects that you've mentioned. Like the connectivity between someone actually knowing and tasting what a new release or new vintage of Bordeaux is and what it tastes like. Like you said, obviously we're fortunate to be able to taste some next week, but people don't really get that opportunity as much as they would do in other regions. They don't get the approachability they get in Burgundy. They don't really get that open door kind of like casual element to kind of walking around Burgundy and going, okay, you can come and taste this great wine. And although many of the Bordeaux estates would say our doors are open, it feels like they're very much too many steps away from the end consumer, I think, with their wines. And actually the rhetoric of the vintage of Bordeaux as a region is covered by everyone else and not the actual people tasting the wine.
No, I think you're right. And I think one point I would like to raise is there is clearly a misalignment between where the chateau think their wines are trading or being bought.
Yeah.
Okay. Not necessarily trading to be like, oh yeah, I'm trading this to then make some money, but actually just like transactions taking place for people that generally want to hold on to the wine for a period of time and enjoy it.
Yeah.
Okay. Versus their release prices. But over the last few years, there have been various different chateaux that have actually thought about this and looked into it and gone, Cheval Blanc's a great example, Figac's a great example, where they've looked at it and gone, actually, we're not just focusing our release price on what the Place de Bordeaux price is for back vintages of Figeac or Cheval Blanc. They're actually looking at the transaction data in various different geographies across various different platforms. That's what more of them need to do. Yeah. Because right now, as we mentioned, out of 100 releases, 20% of them work, and then maybe 8 to 10% of them really work. So there has to be some drive to really better understand where secondary market trading is taking place.
Yeah. Well, look, we've got some wine that's been poured out for us by our assistant Alexa, and this is our blind tasting. So yeah, we don't know what the wine is. We'll be swirling and sniffing, I suppose, to try and get close to the correct answer. We've had a couple of oohs and ahs already from the guest, which might suggest that he knows the answer already without even tasting it.
I'd like to go on record just again to say that I didn't. I've only probably said it.
He's
twice
backing out
now.
already. He's backing out already. Selected by Paul.
Just to let you know, like I have had a bit of a cold for like the last couple of weeks.
So here come the excuses.
It's so funny though when
you've already used two of mine. I can't even use them.
Though, when you do put like a glass of wine into like in front of someone, it doesn't matter like their experience or sophistication when it comes to wine.
Yeah.
And you ask them like, "Oh, we're going to put you on the spot and blind taste." The amount of people that'd be like, "Oh yeah, no, I would be good at this, but no, I've recently had a cold."
You've got to build in your excuses. You've got to build in your excuses already. I mean, what's your approach? I mean, we might as well just talk about blind tasting quickly because this is the task. What's your approach? Do you have a particular approach to blind tasting?
Guess loads of times.
Hope for the best.
What's the saying? Throw as much mud at the wall.
I think it's just. I mean, you, Tom. To be honest, you're probably best to describe it. But from what I've learnt from you in particular is trying to find sort of memories of things you've obviously tasted already. Try and find aspects of the flavour profile and the smell and the wine itself as to maybe pairing that to what you might have experienced before. I mean, I'm going to put my neck on the line.
Initial impressions?
Yeah, initial impression for me is
style of the wine?
It feels like it's hot climate.
Yeah, if it's ripe, for sure.
Yeah.
So it could be old world, but maybe it's definitely a hot vintage or a hot climate. I agree with that wholeheartedly, straight off the bat. And what was it about the wine as soon as you tasted it or smelt it that gave you that
just very
clue?
like ripeness, like you said, red fruit, quite jammy almost on the palate initially.
Yeah.
I think it finishes quite short as well, which makes me feel like it's not as necessarily old world, but that might be completely wrong.
I think it's quite high alcohol.
Yeah, definitely that, 100%.
I think on the finish, it's maybe not. When saying that's short, I think it's got quite a lot of tannins.
It crunches quite quickly.
You've got quite a lot of dryness on the finish there, which I think is
yeah.
quite high tannins. I mean, if I was to go straight off the bat, first impressions, but we'll give ourselves a bit more time. It feels like, if you're thinking, okay, high alcohol, high acidity, high tannins, it's probably going to be maybe old world from a right vintage. It could be more on the Italian end of the spectrum. It's probably where I'd be leaning just straight off the bat, having tasted it.
Yeah, I mean, you do get a lot of those red cherry
which could
characters,
be
which is
Italian.
very much associated with, Northern Italian wines. I think color profile doesn't necessarily scream to me, Northern Italy.
Yeah, quick guess anyway. Let's go off the bat. I'm going to lead us off once more onto the breach and say that this is a young-ish vintage of a Chilean. I don't know exactly what label.
Yeah, great varietal. Actually, we're going for some sort of Bordeaux blend on that basis.
Yeah, I'm now thinking that's completely wrong, but can I change it? Someone else go first.
Actually, just on that second taste that I had, I was getting a lot more of the tannins, and I would say age profile for me, it's probably around 10 years old. Okay.
Yeah, I was thinking like 2016,
2017.
2016.
Yeah, I don't know. What is it? Could it be Bordeaux blend from Italy?
My initial straight away just thought process was like Northern Italy for the reasons I said. I don't think it's Northern Italy because it hasn't got the violets and cherry, and just something about the dryness of the tannins doesn't feel like Barolo. So I've moved away from that. I still have a foot in the Italian camp, and I think if I was looking at it, I'd probably go definitely Sangiovese over Bordeaux blend, just because it's a little bit lighter on the palate. I think that it's. I
just don't think it's got enough structure to be blended.
I think it's medium bodied. I think so. I don't think it's got the structure of Bordeaux blend, but I could be completely wrong. So I would go like 2016 Brunello, maybe. That's where I would go. That's my just quick guess, but we'll give ourselves a bit more time to reflect on it. And if you have any ideas, or if the wine changes,
hopefully my answer will come to
jump in.
The law of averages would suggest that I'm not going to get it right today.
So where are you? You're like Bordeaux blend Italian, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Me and you are around the same age, so I think. So look, I mean, we've been talking about Bordeaux, and I think what's happened in the last couple of weeks is we had a couple of high-profile people in the wine world, very well-respected people in the wine world, of course. Jonathan Robinson, Neil Martin published quite public, articles around the campaign. Jonathan's campaign, Dispatch from Bordeaux, was in the Financial Times and also on her own personal website. And the other one, Neil Martin, was published in Venice Media. His one was called "The Crisis Laid Bare."
I've kind of erased that one from my memory. Actually.
Yeah. Let's pick it apart. I mean, it's obviously a attention-grabbing headline, but
my initial thought process, regardless of what was said in the articles, is it's this kind of. Are we overcorrecting? Are we over-engineering? Are we trying to kind of force kind of theories onto a market situation that is actually a broader market condition and not maybe specific to Bordeaux? That's just my initial reaction. I think there's that kind of
massively
knee-jerk overreaction rather than kind of taking a step back and appreciating there's obviously a situation that needs to be resolved and things need to improve, but maybe not as drastically as it's being communicated. But Jonathan, do you want to read out maybe some of the high profile quotes that we've pulled from both of these articles as talking points?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, completely agree with what you said. And I think it's, goes into what we were briefly discussing earlier. I think Bordeaux is kind of in the spotlight. The market's not in a great spot. And I think ultimately it's in the firing line, so to speak. And I think, for Neil Martin to come and give some of these comments that we'll now discuss, I think we can kind of try and pick apart exactly what we think is fair and what isn't. We'll start with luxury does not discount. Now it has to. What do you make of that, AG?
Look, I think there has been a significant drive over the last decade or so for wine producers to elevate their brands, okay, and this isn't a new thing, okay. Let's not forget that. Like some of the top wines in the world have been the top wines in the world for centuries, okay, and I would say that with the emergence of new participants when it comes to collecting wine, appreciating wine, there are various different ways of communicating and marketing your message and your brand, for right and wrong, for good and bad. Like most things, there's always a balance there's a balance to be had. But I do think there is an argument to suggest that buyers have become more selective. They've become more knowledgeable. Okay, so they're just not prepared to pay whatever it takes to get that particular wine or vintage. Yeah. Okay. We can't overlook that. Yeah. Okay. So do I think? I don't know if Neil meant this when was it Neil that you mentioned?
Yeah.
I don't know if Neil Martin
about luxury.
Yeah, about luxury being discounted. But I think we're in an environment where luxury has suffered. Okay. Interest rates are higher. One of the main luxury markets, mainland China, has been suffering over the last couple of years, as I think our MD of Asia, Joe, mentioned in the previous pod. So something has got to really give in terms of like re-engaging with buyers, and also I think if the story is well told and well understood, then that's different, because you're like, actually, we're really communicating this message around luxury, around scarcity, around history, around brand, around heritage, all of those elements. But actually, the question mark I have is like, how well understood is that message? How on point are the brands? And that's probably the issue. That's where they need to close the gap. Yeah. And
in a world now as well, obviously, as we previously discussed in the last pod, that it's a much more level playing field. It's much more, lateral in terms of how many critics are able to quite quickly define how people are going to approach this vintage. I mean, some of these comments that we'll continue with are like, they're pretty damning towards this vintage. But it strikes me that Bordeaux is just in that place where it kind of puts all of its laundry out, onto the line, like not any other region really does in such a way. During En Primeur, everyone's there. At this day and age, everyone gets click of a button feedback immediately for the vintage, and it's like, well, there's nowhere really for them to go. So for critics to take this approach and hone in on Bordeaux specifically, I feel like it's a little bit unfair, personally.
But there is, I think. Look, 2024 vintage is in the spotlight. Okay?
Yeah.
And this is just a small moment in time in the context of the whole wine market. Okay, we're talking about a couple of months.
Yeah.
Okay, in one of the most storied products, ever to be produced.
Yeah.
Okay, so sometimes you can, to your point, you can overstate. As well. People haven't stopped buying Bordeaux. If you have a look at the bid action on Bordeaux over the last couple of months. Okay?
Well, I was even just going to say, like on our CultX platform, for example, like it's always the most popular market. Like people bidding on bidding and buying on Bordeaux.
What's happened over the last couple of months? Okay, the reception for 2024 has been mixed. Okay, we've we don't need to go over that again. But people are buying 2022 because people have read the reviews around 2022 and the bid volumes are up for 2022. It's just about to become physical. It's one of the best ever vintages of Bordeaux. Yeah. The bid volumes in 2021 are up. Yeah. Okay, what are the most competitive bids in the market at the moment? 2021 Becherel, 2021 on Lynch Barge, 2021 Angelus, 2021 Montrose.
And there's no region that needs hindsight more than Bordeaux, obviously, because it just needs that time. And to really truly assess a vintage on its first release now, yes, okay, price is a big factor, but here, Neil goes on to say Bordeaux is facing its biggest crisis since the 1930s. Again, to Aarash's point, is that rhetoric in this moment in time where Bordeaux just happens to be in this window of being thrown darts at? I think perhaps a little bit, probably. This vintage will probably come to light in 10 years and actually look back and think this was actually really good value for a lot of these wines. Yeah,
I think the connection to luxury is an interesting one. And I think that we've been in a deflationary period for luxury assets for the last 2 years, right? 23 to now, and still in that period. Interestingly, actually, like someone all three of us knows who's in the real estate game actually posted something on their social media this morning about real estate, London real estate, talking about, okay, in their particular context, it was about millionaires leaving London and there being a buying opportunity and that it's cyclical and, now's the best time to be getting into something that's a long-term asset that's always been proven. And I kind of commented it saying like, what you've posted there could literally be reposted, take out London real estate and put in wine, put in watches, put in cars, put in art. That same piece that you've just written could be for any of those other assets. And I think that's the interesting thing, which is, of course, you have to be very specific to your own industry. And obviously, this is very specific to Bordeaux, which is a cornerstone of the wine market, cornerstone of the investment collector, fine wine market, and is important that it's working and functioning. And I think all of us would agree that there's improvements that could be made. But at the same time, let's not overlook the bigger picture, which is we have been in a deflationary period, which has impacted all wines from all regions and impacted the wine market broadly for the last 2.5 years. So of course, when you're in that type of environment, even something like En Primeur is going to struggle, even if it was priced at the best prices possible. Yeah. I mean, even if every wine came out at the best price of any vintage, I still think we would have seen less buying than we saw in 2019.
Yeah,
like
I was going to say, he says also here, slash release prices by 50-60%, swallow your pride. It's not really about pride, I don't think. There's so many more economics at play. I mean, you mentioned it last time when you think about the overheads and the running costs of producing these wines. Like, the way that the frustration I have with some of these comments and the way that article was written in particular by someone like Neil Martin, obviously with such a following, is I think it's quite it's a bit finger pointing to the estates. It's like they're not necessarily not swallowing pride. I think they're just trying to work out themselves exactly where to price in what is effectively a very difficult market.
We could use one example which I think brings it to life a little bit more. Yeah, is that a month before the EP releases, Chateau Latour released their 2016 at £6,200 per case. Okay, so and that was really well received by the market. Okay, so actually, you don't have to. I know the dynamics are slightly different, but that was a point in time. Yeah. A month before the releases, where we had a really successful and exciting release from Bordeaux. Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily mean that Bordeaux's in crisis and no one's drinking Bordeaux and no one wants to buy, Bordeaux at all.
Well, can I just jump in on that, because I'm going to put a quote from Jancis, who in her article said that she was kind of saying that the reasons for some of the trends we're seeing at the moment is that there's a trend towards no and low alcohol wines, casual consumer behaviour. And kind of like fundamental consumer shifts. Do you buy into that? Do you think that's the main reason behind this, or not?
Again, this is a very, very complex question to answer. Yeah. And I think there are a lot of competing opinions, around it. unlike most things, I don't really have a strong opinion about this because I think I am in a pretty biased position. You know, I love drinking wine. I surround myself with friends, clients, colleagues, family members who like to somewhat biased then. Yeah, so you know who like to drink wine. But one of the ways I try to probably contextualize it is that I like to go out to eat quite a lot. Yeah. Okay. And you know, when you go to restaurants and you're trying to get, you know, reservations at some of these restaurants, wherever it may be, whether it's like London, Barcelona, Madrid, wherever it may be, okay, it's difficult to get in. Okay. And when I look around and I see the people that are dining there, you know, it's not like my mum and dad dining there who are like 70 plus.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
It's like people that are like my age.
Yeah.
Or, you know, around my age.
You're not going to tell people what that is. Just keep it a secret. Keep it under your hat.
Very young.
But, you know...
Looks can be deceiving.
But, you know, they're enjoying a tasting menu. They're at their, you know, one of the restaurants that they've really wanted to go to. And they're having the wine flights with their tasting, tasting menu. So, again, you know... I know there's a lot of column inches written about it, and I'm not going to sit here and say that I've got the intel and I've got the, you know, perspective, you know, around it. But, you know, in my small world, I find it a difficult argument to get behind.
The only data point I have is like when everything's going badly or things in the market have sort of suffered and, you know, whatever, you know, the kind of negative rhetoric is at the moment. Everyone's always, you know, you're grasping for reasons, justify it, explain it. Why is it happening? Yeah. And some of these justifications like, oh, it's been a fundamental consumer shift. I would ask those people to rewind 2 years ago to when the biggest year for wine ever happened in 2022. And I think between 22 and 2025, and let's not say 25, let's say 24, within 2 years, are you telling me that everyone who was literally bending over back, falling over themselves to buy wine in 22, and everyone I know enjoyed the record revenues in that year, whether it's auction houses, distributors, importers, we know we were there. And in 2 years, there hasn't been that much of a consumer shift in behaviour that everyone who was buying has suddenly decided not to drink anymore, and that's why it's not happening. It's a fundamental issue because of the macroeconomic environment, the interest rate environment, the deflationary period we've been going through, in my opinion. On top of that, there has been maybe some structural inefficiencies that have been exacerbated or highlighted, which I think need to be spotlighted and discussed and maybe improved in time. And actually, when you go through this more negative downturn in the market, it kind of shines a light on those things that maybe were kind of papered over. When everything's going amazing, everyone kind of ignores it a little bit because, everything's going amazing. Now everything's going badly. Yes, it is shining a light on things that need to be shone on, but it's not saying that there's a fundamental change to the demand and interest in fine wine. I just don't believe that's the case.
All of my defences to Bordeaux, just quickly, was like exactly what you said there. And I think actually it could end up being, which I think was also referenced in terms of this being a real axis point for Bordeaux in particular, but by proxy the wine market. I think seeing it where it's now being sort of portrayed, and I think some of this sort of lazy rhetoric, I think I'm going to say it's lazy personally, but that's my opinion. And I think it will come out the back of that even stronger as a result, because it will be looked back on upon this time where people did say things were shifting too far. This was too much of a difficult situation for Bordeaux to get out of, for the wine market. I think there's going to be a really interesting amount of resurgence that comes out of this across regions. So I think it's going to be exciting.
I've got a lovely new feature, because I think we've talked about Empereur a lot and Bordeaux a lot in the first podcast. Obviously, we talked about it today, and obviously, hopefully, we can kind of draw a line on it a little bit.
I think the next one should be about Bordeaux as well.
Yeah, exactly. I've got a game just to kind of be the moment we kind of bookend this conversation about Empereur. And I'd like you to play along with me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to name certain consumer items, things that people will be familiar with, especially if they're from the UK, and I'm going to name a wine, and I want you to tell me which one is more expensive out of the two. So it's a game of higher or lower. So the first one is, I went on to Deliveroo, which is a food delivery app in the UK. If you're not from the UK and you're not familiar with it.
There are other options available.
There are other options available. But I went, Uber Eats, Just Eat, all the. If you want to sponsor this pod, then obviously we are.
Ask Jay.
I went on to Deliveroo, and I put into Nando's. People familiar with that restaurant. 4 boneless chicken thighs.
Oh, that's my order. Hot.
Yeah, well, I don't think that impacts the price, but it can be extra hot. 4 boneless chicken thighs, extra 2 regular
crispy.
sides.
Yeah.
Got to listen carefully here. 2 regular sides, 1 Coke, and a side of halloumi.
Yeah.
Okay, is that more or less expensive than the retail price of Chateau Langoa Barton 2024, which was scored 92 to 94 points? So that's a classified Bordeaux wine that scored 92 to 94 points from William Kelly. Which one is more expensive? The Nando's?
A bottle, obviously, to clarify.
Sorry?
A bottle of...
One bottle, yeah. One bottle.
That's actually quite a tight one, I think. That's tighter than you think. That's a quite tight one. I would say for the Nando's order, this is like my staple order.
Yeah.
I'd go...
Well, no, just because we've got 5. We've got 5 to get through. So which ones do you think is more expensive?
I think the Nando's is more expensive.
Nando's more expensive?
Yeah. I would say the Langoa just.
Okay, so 1-0 to Jay. The Nando's was more expensive. So including the delivery fee on delivery, it was £29.52.
Oh, sorry, the delivery fee.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
you premium member there.
And then Langoa Barton came in at £26.
So without a delivery fee, I would have been right.
Okay, well,
1-0.
you know,
1-0.
VAR.
1-0.
Okay, next one is a pub in Soho, quite well known on Instagram, the Devonshire. How much? So what's more expensive? 2 pints of Guinness and 2 glasses of house white. So nice order for if you're on a double date. Or
just by yourself.
That's just my order. That's me on a Friday lunch.
Or Chateau Beausejour Bacot 2024, one of my favourite wines, scored 95 points by William Kelly. Which one's more expensive?
Beausejour Bacot.
Okay.
Just. Again.
I'm going to go with the Devonshire.
So the more expensive item was the Beausejour Bacot. So that's 1-1. So the 2 pints of Guinness and 2 glasses of house white came in at £34. Absolute snip. So that's how much you have to pay in London to go out for a drink. For one, if you're Jay. And the Beausejour Bacot was a retail price of £37.50. But that's good value. £37.50 for a 95-point wine from Saint-Emilion Grand Cru. Okay, so next one is an Uber, and this is important. So this is a comfort. I did put in comfort. It wasn't exec and wasn't one
Why
of the
would you
ones.
ride any other way, Tom?
So Uber Comfort from central London, in particular Mayfair to Heathrow Airport.
Yeah.
Or Chateau Calmes Haut Briand, which was scored up to 96 points and was probably the wine of the vintage in terms of both how well it sold and
Are we talking about
the
peak
quality.
time for Uber? Or
I put it in at around 6 p.m. yesterday, so yeah, I suppose it would have been peakish
peak.
time. It wasn't like a price surge.
Okay.
It wasn't price surge.
Yeah.
So which one do you think is more expensive? The Uber to Heathrow Airport or Chateau Calmes Haut Briand?
Uber.
Yeah, you're both right.
Yeah,
Uber was
easy one.
£66.
Finish on an easy one.
Whereas Chateau Calmes Haut Briand's 59. I've got 2 more. Okay, final one. So next one. So quickly, 2 tickets to see Mission Impossible on Friday night at View Cinemas or La Dame de Montrose, the second wine of Chateau Montrose.
That's a slow Friday night for someone, isn't it?
The former, you mean? Yeah, I'd say that the Dame de Montrose is cheaper.
Yes.
Trick question. They're the same price.
Oh.
They're the same price. And finally,
You get
last
way
one.
more for your money with the Dame de Montrose.
Last one. Jay, you should know this because you travel on the trains regularly. So London Euston to Manchester.
Yes.
Train guy. London Euston to Manchester at 6:33, single, or La Mission Haut Briand.
The UK trains are...
They're very expensive. Depends on when you book them.
Price.
Well, we are talking about one of the greatest wines from Bordeaux.
Amazing wine.
The unofficial 6th Grove, La Mission Haut Briand, 95 points.
Can I phone Jeff Linton?
Go on quickly, Jay. What do you think?
I'm going to say La Mission is more expensive.
I'm going to go for the train ticket.
Aarash gets it. Train ticket, £152. The London to Manchester at 6:33. La Mission Haut Briand, a snip, in my opinion, at £145.
Unbelievably good value.
£145 for La Mission Haut Briand. Like, come on.
Yeah.
So I think, look, when you look at some of these things in isolation, you take all the hyperbole away.
Yeah.
I mean, you can think these are quite good value wines in the context of everyday items. So yeah, that was a bit of fun. Has anyone's opinion changed of the wine yet? Because we haven't got long before we have to give our final options. Mine has it slightly, I'll be honest.
It has?
Yeah.
Okay, well, you're probably wrong then. I'm gonna go with... I'm in Italy. Okay, I'm still in Italy.
We're still in Italy. That gives me confidence now.
I'm still in Italy. I'm saying the vintage could be... I don't think it's like an exceptional vintage. I would say I'm in Tuscany and I'm 2017.
Bordeaux blend, right?
2017.
Bordeaux blend.
Yeah.
I've changed mine. Am I in? I think I'm thinking
What, like La Volte or something?
Northern
like that?
Rhone. Northern Rhone 2018.
producer.
It's definitely not that.
Yeah, I think we can safely say.
I was just trying to bring some. There you go. Juicing up the energy.
You think it's what do you think?
I don't want to put more pressure on these shoulders.
If it is that,
after the introduction, so
you're gonna have to walk out
I think
with your trousers down.
Yeah,
again,
could be right. Okay, we've got a little bit more time. We have to put our final answers down on paper. But Jonathan, take us away on a topic that's not Bordeaux.
Yeah, so I felt that, or we felt that it would be good to cover something, as you say, a bit more in current press. In fact, today at 5:30 Eastern Daylight Time is the first auction of celebrated wine collector, probably, I mean, not just within the shores of the US, globally, William Koch. Not just the contents of his cellar, but the cellar itself is a thing of beauty. And he's decided to, at a ripe old age, where he can't possibly drink the entire cellar himself, he wants to share that with, the wider wine community. So, I guess it just brings about quite interesting points that we've leaning into in terms of the involvement of the wine market. Will there be another William Koch?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think the interesting thing for those who might not have heard of him before is obviously the impact he has had on the wine market when it comes to counterfeit wines. And of course, William Koch was involved with both the Thomas Jefferson bottles,
Hardy Road and Stockton,
famous of the Billionaire's Vinegar book, which if anyone who's interested in wine hasn't read that book, please do.
It's great,
I think I'm reliably informed Brad Pitt got the rights to that book to make a film. I'm pretty sure, I think Brad Pitt's company's got the rights to make a film out of that book. I don't know whether it'll be happening anytime soon, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. And of course, for those that have got a Netflix subscription, they might have watched Sour Grapes, which was, of course, around the Indonesia counterfeiter
Chateau Rudy
Kurniawan, who was probably the most high-profile case that went to court, and he went to jail for, God, it must have been, he's out now, isn't he? But was it 7-8 years he went to federal prison?
I mean, there's been some interesting stories now that he's out.
No, he's out, yeah.
So, I mean, Bill Koch had a massive impact on the market. 18,000 bottles are going to be going on the auction block. Some incredible.
Do you know what's on there?
Yeah, I'm just looking. Some 1947 Cheval Blanc, which is obviously iconic Bordeaux wine. We're looking 6-litre bottles of La Tâche from Domaine Le Romanée-Conti. We've got a couple of inches of La Tâche up there. But a 6-litre Methuselah, which is particularly rare. I mean, they make, I think, 10 a year of the 6 litres or something like that.
Yeah, less than less, yeah.
But, when I read about this auction, I think the thing that was really unique, and I think the thing that was kind of mentioned by Christie's is, we're getting to a point in time in 2025 now where getting hold of, really old vintages of Bordeaux and Burgundy from the top producers is becoming increasingly difficult, especially with the level of sort of condition and provenance that these wines and these bottles bring to auction. And when we talk about old wines, we're talking really about sort of early 20th century, even 19th century wines. You just don't really see these wines anymore. There used to be a time, even when we started in the industry, where you could go to some European restaurants, especially places like Germany and Belgium, where you would still find, early 20th century bottles on the wine list, and you could drink them at fairly good prices. And what's happened over the last 10-15 years is they've all just been targeted, they've all been drunk up. So this is
news
becoming,
travels fast in those places.
But Jay, you made a really good point quickly just around sort of, will we see another collector of this nature again in the future? So that's an interesting talking point. But one of the things that was brought up by Christie's was the fact that this presents an opportunity for the new generation. Is this an opportunity of passing the baton from the older generation to the new generation and allowing some of these new collectors to get their hands on these kind of fame and prize bottles? So what are your thoughts just generally around kind of the auction and some of those
firstly,
comments?
I think on William Koch, he has done an incredible job at sanitizing the really top end of the fine wine market. I mean, this is someone that's invested a lot of his time and resource and money. There's suggestions that he spent $35 million on a quest to authenticate and ensure there's no fraudulent or fraudulent bottles in his collection. Okay. So much so that I heard that he's hired this nucleus spectrograph. Don't ask me what it does or how it works. But I've heard it's pretty good. And analyzing the matter for the labels, the wines themselves. So I think as a collection goes, this is like the apogee.
This is.
I would say.
Yeah.
This is the apogee. Okay.
Yeah.
So
more so than Pierre Chen's collection.
Yeah.
But maybe because of the influence and importance that he's had on
if
him
you think
on the
about
market.
it, like Pierre Chen, I don't know whether it's public, whether he went through the episodes with Hardy or whether he went the episodes with Rudy, right? Whereas, William Koch went through the 1870, Lefit Rothschild example. Does everyone know about? No, 1870.
What?
1870.
Not the Jefferson
Do you know the example where basically what they did is to identify that Lefit 1870 wasn't legit. They looked at the label on the bottle and it was stuck to the bottle,
right? With glue
with PVA glue.
Amazing.
Okay,
Yeah.
And the PVA glue wasn't actually invented since after the Second World War.
Yeah. Well, the other thing they used to test it is the radioactive molecules post Hiroshima. So since the atom and the bomb and the hydrogen bomb were launched, there are certain isotopes that exist within the Earth's atmosphere that couldn't possibly have been in the actual original molecules of the liquid before obviously a certain date. So that's another way they test for the age of wine, especially from obviously pre sort of 20th century wines, is whether they can identify these isotopes in the molecules.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Tom.
We're getting a bit wine nerdy here.
No, but we wouldn't even have known about these things if it wasn't for William Koch. He's the person that, as you said, spent the money trying to find these things out.
So I think if you think about the question, passing the baton on, there are, I think at the moment the market's quite bifurcated, right?
Yeah.
You've got, I think, the high end of the market that are willing and prepared to spend because they see this as an interesting entry level. If
this auction, particularly or generally,
just generally,
yeah.
Okay, and then you've got like people starting their maybe wine journey, that we've experienced on, a platform that we know about. Okay,
right. Yeah.
So this is a great opportunity to actually interact with a collection that has been perfectly kept. Okay, that's gone through all the due diligence, as much of the due diligence and provenance as you can, at a time when actually the market's probably less crowded, right? So yeah, I think it's.
Can I ask you a question?
No.
Then that's the podcast done.
I'm gonna ask one without asking if I can.
Because just generally, do you think bottles of wine that are attached to known people, well, let's say celebrities or people of this type of stature, should they be worth more? Like, do you think there's a premium paid for a bottle that comes from William Koch's cellar versus?
Well, let's look at the precedent.
Sorry
to interrupt. Let's look at the precedent. Okay, so you had the 1945 from the Durand collection, which broke the world record. Okay,
well, that's ex-cellar, right?
Yeah. Okay. So and then,
would you pay more? Would you pay more for the ex-cellar Robert Durand 45 Romney Conti? Let's say William Koch had a 45 Romney Conti in his cellar. Do you think that should be worth more because it comes from him?
I think. Do you
think collectors or buyers would put more of a premium on who it came from, or does that not really matter?
Well, I think there's additional cachet there which you can't really put a finger on, depending on how famous or who the person is. But obviously, with that, you're also buying, like you would do a house or a car or anything. Yeah. The additional layer of the fact that, as Aarash pointed out, he spent millions and millions authenticating his collection. So you're buying almost provenance as much as anything.
But then an ex-seller can give you that provenance.
Yes,
right?
of course.
But it doesn't give you that cachet.
Yeah, I mean. Just moving on quickly from that.
Also, sorry, just on that point, sorry to interrupt, Jay. We had the Joseph Lau collection recently, as well. And for those of you that don't know, he's like a billionaire property tycoon in Hong Kong. Yeah. And we also had the La Poule auctions. Yeah. That will hit some ridiculous
overestimate almost everything.
Hammer prices. So I don't know. I feel like yes, the collector makes a difference for sure. There's additional cachet. There's additional, interest. Sometimes it can be a little bit their circle as well. Their friends. The networks they're in that will drive those prices up. But that's probably a story for another pod. You've also got the actual provenance and authenticity that Jonathan mentioned.
But I tell you what, I mean, next pod will be really interesting to look at some of the prices, the hammer prices, what these wines go for, and just have a look at a comparison with the market and see whether there was a premium paid. And I think you're probably right, there will be. And we can maybe evaluate that for the next one.
I was going to say that we almost run out of time, but I think it in terms of obviously recreating what he's created in what it looks like, I think that's perhaps less likely to happen nowadays. But smaller cellars, more functional cellars in big houses.
Let me ask you guys a question. Sorry, do you engage with people? Do you speak to people that, not necessarily on the William Koch scale, but you speak to people and say, oh, there's younger, maybe they just like had an exit from their company or like a company they work with or something like that. Do you actually engage with people that say, I want to build a collection because I've got a young family and I'm into this asset class and I'm really passionate about wine consumption? I think those conversations do take place. Maybe not on the scale of like a William Koch every.
But he's once in a generation, really. But I think I was looking into like the sort of stats around his. I'd urge anyone that hasn't just to look at his cellar, like pictures of it, just the extent of his level of detail, his search for like perfection in the cellar, not just the contents, but the actual cellar itself. And I think that is just an interesting thing to then look at, the sort of semantics around, okay, younger people aren't drinking and things that we've covered, fair enough. But I looked at some interesting stats around like multi-million-dollar properties in the US, for instance. And actually now it's deemed that, a quite big buxom cellar at the base of a big, big, expensive house is actually deemed to be a slightly if and but, does that actually add value anymore? Maybe not. Are people starting to transition those into like multifunctional places of the house? Whereas actually like wine walls, different ways of having a wine collection in your house that's not necessarily the old like traditional William Koch type cellar. That aspect interests me. And even like before he sells it all, I feel like he could easily offer like there'd be hundreds of thousands of people that would be wanting to go and visit his cellar to walk around.
Yeah,
it.
he's not
even testing the contents.
He's not selling his whole collection. It's a part of his collection.
Part of his collection, No, of course. But like I think that engagement tool of like what we're talking about, younger generations trying to find the excitement of what it feels like to be at the very peak.
Do you think the next generation have a desire to be the next great collector? It almost feels like a generational shift in terms of like maybe the generation above us, culturally there was like some cachet towards being known as a great collector. And I remember having dinner once with someone who's a big collector in London, and their aspiration, verbatim, and they're a very big collector, was to have an auction with one of the auction houses where they had one of those coffee book auction, books created, which is of course what William Koch had. And that was kind of, why are you collecting wine? Oh, I'm collecting wine because one day I want to have a collection rare enough, prestigious enough to be able to have, whether it's Ackers or Zacky's or Christie's or Sotheby's or one of the big auction houses, put it in and say, this is the great collection of X. And I have a book and I'll forever have that moment in time. And I think to myself, that was really, first, as the only person I ever heard say that, I thought it was really interesting because, again, if I compare it to maybe sort of the billionaires that we've been very fortunate to know and have experience with in, say, like Asia, I don't feel like any of them have ever communicated that's their desire. Like the guys that have got incredible collections, maybe on a comparative level, maybe not in terms of vintage depth, but maybe in terms of the quality of the wines, have got comparative levels to someone like a William Koch.
Yeah.
Their desire is to drink the best wines in the world. Like they've never said to me,
pure passion,
I'm doing this because one day I want to put it into, Sotheby's Hong Kong. They're doing it because they are literally just have a desire to drink these wines.
The best stuff,
But maybe that will change as they get older. So I just think it's an interesting like
100%.
Generational shift.
Yeah, that's what I mean. But I also think if you don't have that visibility or if you don't have that experience or knowledge even of this auction happening and what it looks like to be that of that generation, how will you ever even decide what you want to be as a new age, younger wine collector?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you have to be that. It means you just might at least take some ideas from that as to where you want to take it.
Yeah. So
just on the auction thing before we move on to the next category, I think what could be interesting geographically, and I was reading this, a couple of weeks ago, is Middle East could potentially be a new area and a new destination for, as we know, some of the larger wine collectors. And I know some of the auction houses are now, not necessarily doing it in the Middle East, but Middle Eastern collectors are now consigning their collections in various auction houses. So I think what we're actually seeing, and again this might answer our question a little bit, is that who's retreated from Hong Kong recently? It's
Zacky's.
Zacky's retreated from Hong Kong
after 16 years.
After 16 years of being there. So does that open up an opportunity for a new area or a new geography to be like the de facto kind of hub for wine auctions? So that's probably one to keep an eye on for
the future.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's time to reveal the
I was
blind.
going to say, yeah, this
the
is
blind wine. Are we?
This
gonna
isn't
put
one of my
our-
spare socks. This
I
is
feel
actually
like I'm under pressure here, to be honest
Well,
with you.
Are you really? Am I really?
yeah.
So, can we just confirm the guesses? Okay.
Right.
We're discounting
Well,
his.
We're discounting yours.
Yeah, Northern Rhone, 2018.
Northern Rhone 2018. Is that where we're landing on?
That's mine.
I'm sticking with Bordeaux blend, Italy.
Bordeaux
And,
blend, Italy.
I'm probably completely wrong. As I
Fine.
said, the law of averages suggests that.
Do you know what I think? When you do blind tasting, you have your gut feel, and then sometimes when you're going on for it for a long time, and you start second guessing yourself, and you think, "Oh no, I've got it wrong. I'm going to change it." It's the worst thing you can do. So I have to back myself, and I think it's nice to have 3 different answers.
Okay.
So I'm going to stick to Italy. I'm going to stick to Sangiovese. So I'm going to go with Brunello de Montalcino. I think it's similar age. What do you say? 20? I think like 2016. Maybe.
I said 2017. Yeah.
I'll go 16.
I would say within. I don't think it's.
You said
old,
10 years
I don't
old.
think it's older than 10 years. Okay.
Huh?
I don't think it's older than 10 years. Tom looks quite nervous.
I don't
actually.
know. I'm always
He
nervous.
looks
I'm
quite
always
I
nervous.
just thought I'd throw out a really rubbish guess just to make you guys feel better.
Okay, let's have a look. Jay's nailed
Oh
it.
no.
No, it's not. It's Southern Rhone. Chateauneuf de Pape. 17.
Not far off,
Well
to
done.
be fair.
You're close enough.
Congrats.
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 I just felt that little violet touch
Yeah,
came in at
not-
the end. That was my
I mean,
thinking.
I say congratulations for being a
Closest.
little bit closer.
For being
for being
closest.
me. For
Yeah.
being me.
For being a little
Thanks.
bit closer.
Yeah, no.
Let me just take a look at this. Hang on. Let me just see what's behind the label. Is it?
Yeah. It's been
Oh, it's fake,
refilled.
that's why. A bit about the wine, though. A great expression of...
2017.
the
I mean, that was
region.
coming off slightly of a riper, hotter vintage than I was anticipating.
Yeah, nowhere near it.
I was nowhere near that. I don't drink
nowhere
enough
near it.
Chateauneuf de Pape, to be fair. That's a bit of a blind spot for me. Do you drink a lot of Chateauneuf de Pape?
Only Chateaubrias.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a slightly different beast.
Great wine, though.
There you go.
I think it's certainly better now than it was at the beginning. I think it's opened out a bit.
There we go, stumped. Right, well, so that's 1-0 Jay. I'll have to try and come back for the next episode and pull level.
I think we're on -1, Tom, for our guesses.
The -1.
Yeah.
Do you get a minus?
One final question, AG.
Yeah.
If you were to give us your most memorable wine experience of the last few weeks, months, years, what would it have been?
That's a tough one. That is a tough one.
What's wowed you?
I got a couple of answers. Okay, and one I gave earlier in the pod, but I'll start with the other one. A few weeks ago, I had the absolute pleasure of tasting Vega Sicilia Unico 1965. Okay, so we're talking about a 60-year-old wine, which was unbelievable.
One of the great labels.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So, like, it's almost like the oak had been integrated because obviously, the style of the winemaking.
Yeah.
It had this like sweetness, this savouriness, caramel.
Has it all, doesn't it?
It was
It's my favourite label.
no, it's mine, not yours.
No.
It's his answer.
Check the
Hang on.
website.
So that was really impressive. Just to have like a 6-year-old wine that was just like
Did you decant it for a
in
while?
such a great spot. No, we didn't
too
decant
old-
it.
too old to
Butler's
decant.
Thief, because
Yeah.
it was
Let it breathe for a bit.
Yeah.
and I think we let it breathe for 10-15 minutes.
Yeah.
Nice.
And it was just an awesome experience. Like, that was unbelievable. That's one of the best wines I've had this year.
Did you have it in a restaurant or did you have it just in a?
No, I enjoyed
tasting environment?
it with a client in our tasting space at the
Yeah,
office.
no food though. We just had it
No
straight.
food,
Yeah.
just straight. Yeah, we had some cheese and charcuterie, but nothing too
Fantastic.
invasive.
What's the second answer?
That was great. And actually, one thing that boggled me a little bit about those bottles,
Right,
yeah,
yeah.
the Unico bottles,
Yeah,
the
they've got
old-
different labels.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
you know that. So
Yeah. No, because we've had like a vertical that's
but
like 45.
I've
in our
actually
office.
you can have the same vintage,
Yeah.
okay,
Different
and you
labels.
can have a different bottle type,
Yeah.
a different label, and a different importer.
Yeah.
So when I didn't actually know this before.
Yeah.
I know you may have known it, but I
Yeah,
didn't know
yeah.
this before. I haven't drunk as much.
Well, they've been in there for ages. It's thrown me off.
Yeah,
how they've all
exactly.
got
Yeah,
different
yeah,
labels.
yeah. And then I was thinking, is this actually like legit?
Yeah, Will Koch would know.
Yeah,
Bill Koch would know the
and then when we opened
That's
it,
why they make different bowls.
Honestly, when we opened it, it was just like this.
Throw him off.
Yeah,
That's why he's got no Vega Sicilia in his cellar.
it was his wow experience.
Yeah, no,
that's amazing.
That was great. And then the other one, which like completely different, obviously completely different age profile, was the shampoo from Bernstein, the 2019.
Yeah,
which I think what impressed me the most is that it's a wine that just gains so much weight and expression and like everything you can think of that you want in a wine.
Yeah.
After just being in the glass for like half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour.
Yeah.
So again, like 19 Burgundy, great vintage, but I think Bernstein shampoo from 19 was really, really impressive.
Yeah, I think the last few vintages from Bernstein, for me, they're up there with the best in Burgundy. I mean, the quality of the Grand Crus is just out of this world. Out of this world. And that's Premier Cru. That's the Premier Cru entry level, which is just still like ridiculously good. Nice. Very good. So that brings us to the end of this episode of Uncorked. Thank you very much to Aarash joining us today. I think it's been a fantastic episode. Great to hear all your thoughts and opinions.
Thanks
about Bordeaux en Primeur.
Definitely.
We thought you might reign supreme on the blind tasting, but unfortunately you have to
got your
tighten it up
in,
for the next one. Jay, thank you very much for joining us again and co-hosting with me.
Yeah.
Have you adjusted to the temperature in here yet?
Slightly, yeah. I think next time I'll be in shorts and a vest. So
slowly but surely, more clothes.
If the air conditioning's not going to join me, I'm going to have to just wear less clothes. So it's fine.
Fantastic.
But yeah, no, good fun. Thank you, Aarash. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely.
And thank you for listening. Yeah, we look forward to next week.
And look, if you are enjoying this podcast, then of course what you have to do is, if you're listening on Spotify, then please subscribe, like the podcast. We very much appreciate that. Please comment. Please give us your comment. Please give us your feedback. In fact, if you've got any suggestions or ideas for improvements to the show or questions you'd like us to answer, then maybe we could throw that out as an option as well in terms of answering listeners' questions. If you're on YouTube, then of course press the like and subscribe button. Again, leave us comments, tell us what we're doing wrong and what we're doing right. But apart from that, I'd just like to thank you for listening and joining us today, and thank you very much.